Bonsoir et bienvenue à tous. Je suis Marie Fraser, conservatrice en chef au Musée d'art contemporain. Alors, bienvenue au musée et j'aimerais tout particulièrement saluer la présence des membres de l'association que nous honorons ici ce soir. Alors, l'Association internationale pour l'étude des rapports entre texte et images. Le Musée d'art contemporain de Montréal est heureux de se joindre au département d'études littéraires et au département d'histoire de l'art, à l'école de design, à la faculté des arts de l'Université du Québec à Montréal, à Figura, le centre de recherche sur le texte et l'imaginaire, au NT2, le laboratoire de recherche sur les arts et les littératures hypermédiatiques, et au centre de recherche interuniversitaire sur la littérature et la culture québécoise, communément appelé le CRILIC, pour présenter cette conférence de John OBrian dans le cadre du 9e congrès international sur l'étude des rapports entre texte et images, dont vous connaissez tous évidemment le thème, l'imaginaire. John OBrian est professeur d'histoire de l'art et professeur agrégé du Peter Wall Institute à l'Université de Colombie-Britannique. Il a abondamment publié sur l'histoire, la théorie et la critique de l'art moderne, s'intéressant en particulier à l'institutionnalisation du modernisme en Amérique du Nord. Dès 2008, et pour une période de 3 ans, il a dirigé la chaire Brenda et David McLean d'études canadiennes. Pendant son mandat, il a examiné les rapports entre la photographie et l'âge atomique au Canada. Sa recherche s'inscrit dans un vaste projet qui s'intitule Camera Atomica sur la photographie, consacré au nucléaire en Amérique du Nord et au Japon et subventionné par le Conseil de recherche en sciences humaines du Canada. Camera Atomica est également le titre d'une exposition que John OBrian prépare pour le Musée des Beaux-Arts de l'Ontario. Sa conférence, intitulée « Representing the Nuclear Imaginary », examine des points d'intersection entre les événements nucléaires, l'imaginaire et la photographie depuis 1945. Mesdames et messieurs, voici John OBrian.
I can't see a thing. Thank you, Marie, for that generous introduction. Il me donne beaucoup de plaisir à être ici ce soir. Merci pour l'invitation. Montreal is a good city to be giving a lecture of this kind in. It is the home of Charles Taylor, who has written so much about the social imaginary. He hangs his hat at McGill. It is also the home of Peter Van Wyck at Concordia University, who has written a book that I think belongs on the same shelf as the most important books about things nuclear. It's called The Highway of the Atom. It's just recently out. He had another book earlier. It's the home to Gordon Edwards, who in 1975 in this city founded the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility. It is the home to Robert Del Tredici, who has consistently been a photographer of the nuclear. His book, At Work in the Field of the Bomb, is one of the great achievements in that field. And at least 2 of those 4 people are here this evening, and I'm glad of it. I want to lecture for about 45 minutes, and then there'll be time for questions. The possibility of doomsday, Hannah Arendt observed in her book On Violence, was the 60s generation first decisive experience in the world. Those born during the Second World War, those who were alive during the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, are psychologically disposed to return to the site of that catastrophe. That has certainly been the case with me. The Cold War was at its height when I entered the University of Toronto as an undergraduate student in 1962. Scarcely more than a month into the term, President John F. Kennedy went on television to announce that Soviet nuclear missiles had been smuggled into Cuba and that the U.S. military had gone on high alert. In the vocabulary of war readiness, the military had moved to DEFCON 3. Over the course of the next few days, the world came as close to the brink of mutual assured destruction, MAD for short, as it has ever been. And I still retain a flash memory of where I was when Kennedy spoke on television on October the 22nd. I was in a house just at the edge of the campus, which has since been knocked down to make way for a library, the Robarts Library. And I sometimes think of the library as a brutalist monument to my flash memory. In the years leading up to the Cuban Missile Crisis, the number of North Americans and Europeans concerned about the arms race and the health hazards of atomic testing was steadily rising. Their awareness of the situation was partly shaped by anti-nuclear peace movements such as the Student Peace Union and the National Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy, a group known simply as SANE, in the United States, and by the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, the CND, in Britain. Bertrand Russell was a prominent member of both CND and SANE, and Martin Luther King spoke for the policies of SANE in Gandhian terms. Quote, "I don't think the choice is any longer between violence and nonviolence in a day when guided missiles are carving highways of death through the stratosphere," he wrote in 1961. "I think it is now a choice between nonviolence and non-existence." King knew how to command the attention of the media, whether his cause was nuclear disarmament or civil rights. So did the CND. Beginning in 1958, the CND mounted a series of nonviolent mass demonstrations that drew wide media coverage. And I show you a photograph here of the first one by Roger Main, the British photographer. And I chose this particular one because the man holding the sign has his tongue in cheek. And this is where photography can complicate what so often seems straightforward. And I'll have more to say about that as things go on. The demonstration took the form of marches between Aldermaston, a nuclear research center in Berkshire, and Trafalgar Square in London. By the early 1960s, the marches were attracting tens of thousands of demonstrators. In the same year that Martin Luther King spoke against death-dealing missiles in the stratosphere, the Canadian Prime Minister John Diefenbaker was confronted by a large anti-nuclear protest on Parliament Hill, as well as by a petition coordinated by the Canadian Committee for the Control of Radiation Hazards. The petition was signed between 140 and 180,000 Canadians and expressed opposition to the installation of American nuclear-tipped Bomark missiles on Canadian soil. It received extensive broadcast and press coverage and caused an already wavering Diefenbaker to waver even more. In the end, the Bomark missile controversy and Diefenbaker's indecisiveness helped to bring down his conservative government. My own return to the site of nuclear catastrophe has occurred primarily through texts and photographs. Photography has shaped the speed and forms of knowledge accessible to nuclear scientists, and the search for scientific knowledge has shaped photography, and I've learned this from texts and photographs. At McGill University in the early 1900s, and I show you a very rudimentary diagram, Ernest Rutherford employed photography to identify the properties of radioactive materials, winning a Nobel Prize for his research. Uranium prospectors used photographic film to find pitchblende, to produce a trace, to turn the invisible into the visible. And at Los Alamos in the mid-1940s, Julian Mack and Berlin Brixner designed specialized cameras for measuring the blast yield of nuclear weapons. And I show you a couple of images on the left, some of the cameras that were specially built, and also the rad gear that is being worn by the cameraman, photographing an aspect of a nuclear blast. And on the right, like a putrid piece of fruit, a photograph that shows the blast in the fraction of a second after it has gone off. And on the right, coming down from the nipple, you can see the pole on which the bomb was placed before the pole gets absolutely destroyed by the blast. The technologies of photography and nuclear fission are intimately, perhaps fatally, interconnected. Nuclear research could not have advanced without photography. In 1964, at the height of the Cold War, Marshall McLuhan observed that both technologies were responsible for creating social environments in which time was speeded up and space compressed. Photography produces, as he says, a world of accelerated transience. And so does nuclear fission. This talk investigates points of intersection between nuclear events, the imaginary, and photography since 1945, as Marie said. Just as the technologies of nuclear fission and photography are more closely recognized than more closely related than generally recognized, so Canada's international engagement with nuclear developments is more extensive than acknowledged. We would not have to probe very deeply to find a connection between this country's nuclear program and Fukushima Daiichi and the 2 nuclear reactors shut down yesterday after the earthquake in Virginia. And one person that can do this better than me is Gordon Edwards, who's in the audience. One of my objectives is to reconsider Canada as a nuclear nation through photographic images. So I'll show a range of imagery this evening, stretching from scientific photographs to photojournalism to advertising pages to popular culture, popular cultural artifacts to fine art photographs. And at the last part of my talk, I'll offer a close reading of just one image. Nuclear photography, as I conceive it, is wide and porous. Canada has an image of itself as a minor actor on the atomic stage, a perception that seems to me in need of renovation. The nuclear narratives that photographs have helped to produce since 1945 are rarely straightforward. And in the lecture, I want to be alert to the ambiguities and the historical layering of the photographs as well as the stories to which they contribute. Images of the sibling bombs, Little Boy and Fat Man, still circulate darkly in our minds, just as radioactive fallout generated by Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and subsequent tests, nuclear tests, circulates in the bodies of most of us, of all of us. And just apropos that, levels of the radioactive chemical strontium-90, after a period of decline, are on the rise again. A Canadian mine at Port Radium on Great Bear Lake in the Northwest Territories supplied the uranium ore used in the bombs dropped on Japan, as well as in test explosions. Another Canadian atomic project, Canadian reactors, the NRX and the CANDU heavy water reactors, developed at Chalk River, Ontario, not very far from here. Some of the scientists were from Montreal, to generate nuclear energy for non-military purposes, served as a source of plutonium for nuclear weapons, for the nuclear weapons program of India, but also Pakistan and other countries. The mushroom cloud, meta-symbol of the nuclear spectacle, is laced with Canadian content. But how does it figure in the Canadian imaginary? Is the maple leaf, to mix my metaphors, stamped all over the mushroom cloud or just on part of it? And I should have been showing some slides. There's some miners at Port Radium. Other miners were First Nations. It looks as if the Caucasian miners were underground and a lot of the Dene people above ground. There's the Chalk River complex in a photograph from 1953 with the NRX, with one of the NRX reactors. And there's the Trinity Fireball, the first color photograph ever taken of the first nuclear test, and the only color photograph, or ones very similar, 3 or 4 of them that have survived. In his book Risk Society from 1992, The sociologist Ulrich Beck argues that science has become so powerful that it can no longer predict or control its effects. This is something scientists don't often realize. Hazards produced by advanced technology on the scale of nuclear devastation, climate change, and species extinction have exposed a fault line between past industrial society and present techno-scientific society. In the former, the positive and negatives of technological advancement could be evaluated more or less accurately. In the latter, they cannot. The negatives now exceed any kind of measurable risk. Risk has become threat. Although nuclear scientists have been generally unwilling to acknowledge it, texts and photographs have played a role in shaping their imaginary, in delimiting it. Beginning with the Manhattan Project, the threats associated with atomic weapons and nuclear energy have been consistently minimized by the techno-scientifico-militaro-diplomatic authorities, as Jacques Derrida has dubbed them, and hidden from public scrutiny. And here, of course, is the sort of thing that a photograph that shows with the nuclear explosion behind, Canadian soil, somebody wearing garbage bags or the equivalent of garbage bags as protection against nuclear attack. And a photograph like that is hard to take seriously. I think it must have been hard to take seriously even at the time, but it certainly is now. The threats to species extinction and the impact of climate change have been similarly minimized. The chemical industry, which was a beneficiary of scientific gains made during the Second World War, did not respond favorably to Rachel Carson's argument in Silent Spring, 1962, that there were limits on technological progress. Nor did they welcome her call for a ban on DDT, the pesticide that was destroying the natural world as surely, she observed, as nuclear weapons had destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I show you a photograph of Nagasaki after the bombing in 1945. Rosalie Bertel, and I show you here a photograph by Bob Del Tredici of her. Rosalie Bertel, in her book No Immediate Danger, Prognosis for a Radioactive Earth from the mid-'80s, criticized governments for persistently blocking access to nuclear information while claiming there was no risk from low-level radiation. Like Carson and Bertel, Elizabeth Colbert, the environmental staff writer for The New Yorker, has been attacked for her investigative work. Field Notes from a Catastrophe, her book from 2006, is a lament on the failure to respond to the effects of climate change. The threats generated by Canada's involvement with nuclear weapons and nuclear energy have likewise been de-emphasized or not disclosed at all by military and government authorities. The language used to talk about them has been designed to deflect attention elsewhere. Radioactive discharges from the Chalk River NRX reactor in 1952, which came close to a complete meltdown. That's close to a complete meltdown, were dismissed as minor, the result of a pinhole leak. Jimmy Carter, subsequently President of the United States, then a naval cadet, was part of the mop-up operation. Sometimes been speculated that his cancer may have come from there. On Valentine's Day, 1950, a United States Air Force plane jettisoned an atomic bomb over Canadian territory. Ice had caused 3 of the engines of a B-36 bomber, and that's the bomber on the right, one of the biggest planes ever built, to fail while it was flying south along the British Columbia coastline en route from Alaska to Texas. Following the emergency protocol established for aircraft carrying atomic weapons, Ship 2075 released its nuclear payload over open water. An Mk4 bomb, the same kind of weapon that was dropped on Nagasaki in 1945, was detonated in Queen Charlotte Sound approximately 90 kilometers northwest of Bella Bella, minus its plutonium core. The device consisted of 5,300 pounds of conventional explosives and 100 pounds of uranium casing. It exploded like a dirty bomb, dispersing radioactive fallout across the region. There was no measurement of that. There's no recorded measurement of it. The crew had time to bail out over Princess Royal Island before the aircraft turned inland and crashed into a mountain in the Kispiox Valley near Smithers. 12 of the crew survived, but 5 were never found. The last survivor was located hanging upside down from a tree, in a tree, from the harness of his parachute. Despite a massive search, the aircraft was not discovered until 3 years later in 1953. In the language of the United States military, this nuclear incident was a broken arrow, the code name for a nuclear weapon that has exploded or been lost, but without risk of igniting a war. It was the first broken arrow ever recorded, and likely the first dirty bomb as well, making the incident a foundational story in the history of nuclear failure. And I show you the shackle, the bomb shackle casing from the aircraft, taken in a photograph fairly recently. Like all good foundational stories, this account of the bomb in the wilderness has symbolic as well as literal dimensions. During the Cold War, United States aircraft armed with nuclear warheads flew regularly over Canada. Michael Byers, in his book Intent for a Nation, recalls seeing the contrails of... I've been skipping things here. I'm too far ahead, sorry. There we are. That's what I meant to show. Forgive me. No lecture would be right without somebody getting mixed up on the slides, preferably the speaker. Michael Byers recalls seeing the contrails of B-52 bombers as a boy above his grandfather's farm in Stoughton, Saskatchewan, as the planes flew north to their advanced staging positions in the Canadian high Arctic. Canada occupied the main geographical zone between the two superpowers. Spatially, it was the filler in a toxic nuclear sandwich. Until the 1980s, historians generally portrayed Canada as little more than a condiment in the nuclear sandwich. The arms race, they contended, was a bipolar contest between the United States and the Soviet Union, in which Canada was an incidental participant. C.P. Stacey, the official historian of the Canadian Army for the Second World War, comments in Canada in the Age of Conflict, a 2-volume study covering the period from Confederation to 1948, that there is no space here to tell the story of Canada's comparatively small involvement in the more than epoch-making international drama of atomic energy. Canada had no part in the bombs dropped on Japan, he declared. Donald Crichton, in The Story of Canada, briefly alludes to El Dorado mining and refining's extraction of uranium at Port Radium, which made possible the federal government's atomic pile at Chalk River near Ottawa, and there's the atomic pile. But he neglects to mention Canada's participation in the Manhattan Project, the 3-nation consortium led by the United States that also included Britain as a third member, or Canada's export of refined uranium ore to the United States for weapons-grade enrichment. Instead, Crichton observes, in an act of painterly displacement, and here I show you the painter A.Y. Jackson on the right at the uranium mine, just at the edge of Great Bear Lake, an act of painterly displacement that the group of 7 depicted the Precambrian shield a quarter of a century before the discovery on it of uranium and other minerals. In other words, a complete deflection. Something that is momentous gets turned to the aesthetic. His decision not to mention the Manhattan Project and Canada's export of uranium to its southern neighbor is like deciding not to mention that photographs of Hiroshima taken before August 6, 1945, look different from those taken after that date. Crichton's erasure of Canada in the production of the atomic bomb represents an act of blindness rather than insight. More importantly, it represents a failure to keep a major event from the past alive in the present. Another photograph by Bob Del Tredici, drums of yellow cake being, uranium at a certain point in the refinement process. And this is from the El Dorado Mines, Blind River, 1986. Most of the uranium mined in Canada was supplied to the United States under military contract. By the 1950s, uranium was the country's fourth largest export after wheat, pulp, and paper. 12,000 tons were produced in 1959, more than by any other nation, most of which went towards the fabrication of nuclear weapons in the United States and Britain. And for that, I'm indebted to Gordon Edwards. Robert Bothwell, Ian Drummond, and John English, in their revised edition of Canada since 1945, published in 1989, and by the way, dedicated to C.P. Stacey, are more attentive to Canada's role in nuclear affairs than most of their predecessors. They do acknowledge that the country's cooperation with British scientists during the war, in combination with its reserves of uranium, made it a global atomic power. In August 1945, the same month that the war ended, the secret atomic complex at Chalk River completed construction of its first operational, the first operational nuclear reactor built outside the United States. This was not an isolated undertaking. A few years earlier, Canadian scientists played a decisive role in persuading President Roosevelt to mobilize American resources for the purpose of developing a nuclear device. And a decade after that, Canada hosted a delegation from Israel that had been sent to gather information on how to construct a nuclear reactor of its own. And I show you the first nuclear reactor in Israel. A postcard, of all things. When Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion announced in the Knesset in 1960 that Israel was building a reactor, he said, and I quote, that it would be similar to the reactor which the Canadian government helped to construct in India, with the difference that our reactor is of a smaller capacity. Had Canada wished to build its own nuclear arsenal following the war, it possessed the necessary scientific expertise and material resources to do so. Prime Minister Mackenzie King opted against the pursuit of a nuclear weapons program, choosing instead to steer a wobbly course between building and banishing the bomb. Canada never joined the Nuclear Armaments Club. Membership is restricted to those countries producing nuclear weapons. But it did become a major supplier of uranium, nickel, and other natural resources crucial to the weapons programs of the United States and Britain. In addition, through long-term agreements, it turned over its coastlines and landmass to the United States for use as proving grounds for nuclear missile and submarine testing. So I show you some missile testing, some shots taken by the U.S. Army in Churchill, Manitoba. At one point, Britain wanted to use Churchill, Manitoba as a proving ground for nuclear explosions, for nuclear testing, and it was dissuaded from doing so not by Canadians but by the weather, and eventually went to Australia. It would have been an environmental catastrophe up there had they gone ahead on the tundra. Canada partnered in the construction of 3 early warning radar systems, including the Dew Line in the Arctic, to sound the alarm against Soviet bomber attack. And here is one of those, not the Dew Line station, but a station in the, up in the Arctic that you see in the amateur photograph on the right. As we've heard, it accepted Bomark missiles on Canadian soil, bringing down the government, but also leading the political theorist and philosopher George Grant to write his enduring Lament for a Nation. And of course, Canada exported Canadian nuclear expertise and uranium around the globe in the form of CANDU and other reactors. And because the CANDU is an efficient producer of plutonium, some of the countries that purchased the reactor transformed it into a mini bomb factory. I show you a reactor in India. At Trombay, photograph taken in 1966. Between Mackenzie King's renunciation of nuclear weapons and governmental assistance in the production and testing of nuclear weapons elsewhere lies a troubled middle ground. Gordon Edwards, founder of the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility, there's no harm in saying it twice, concludes that since the Second World War, and I quote, Canada has played a major role in fostering the proliferation of nuclear weapons throughout the world. Perversely, or so it seems to me, the perception that Canada has been a bit player in the proliferation sweepstakes may have been strengthened by the international success of peaceful anti-nuclear protest movements founded in Canada. Greenpeace was founded in Vancouver in 1971 to protest the American nuclear testing at Amchitka, Alaska. And I show you here some of the work that it's doing in the South Pacific against French testing, a photograph of that. And the Raging Grannies were formed in Victoria in 1987 to protest the presence of nuclear-equipped American warships and submarines in local waters. Both caught the imagination of the public and became household names, and not just in Canada. The nuclear, I put a page behind that I didn't mean to put behind. William L. Lawrence, Atomic Bill as he was known, the New York Times journalist who was embedded in the Manhattan Project, not a word he would have used, but I'm using purposefully, despite some wouldn't want me to use it, flew in a B-29 bomber on the Nagasaki mission and is credited with coining the term the atomic age. Working the nuclear beat, Lawrence adopted the viewpoint established by military and government authorities. He framed his articles in positive terms, writing shortly after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that, and I quote, atomic energy brings within sight the realization of the dream of the ages, to transmute the elements and create wealth far greater in value than gold. In other words, his is an alchemical view of nuclear weapons. According to Lawrence, the era began on the morning of July 16, 1945, with the Trinity test at Alamogordo, and he was on hand to witness the detonation, as were dozens of cameras. I don't have photographs of the cameras there, but I show you some of the cameras used for the first tests in Bikini in 1946. My own research on the era, on the age of nucleonics, as some scientists called it in the early days, dates from October 2002, so almost 10 years now. It was triggered by a geopolitical shift. I was preparing to deliver a lecture in the United States on abstract expressionism and Cold War anxieties when I came across the nuclear posture review submitted by the Bush administration to Congress on December 31st, 2001, a few months after the suicide attacks on the World Trade Centers. Startled by what I read, I adjusted my lecture to take account of the atomic imaginary of the abstract expressionists during the early decades of the Cold War, incorporating comments by Jackson Pollock, Willem de Kooning, Barnett Newman, David Smith, and Mark Rothko into my remarks. I wanted to reflect on how their atomic anxieties might have a place in their work, as well as about how they might compare, or how one might compare their comments with those of the present. The Nuclear Posture Review called for the development of a new generation of nuclear weapons, including mini-nukes such as the robust nuclear Earth penetrator, a low-yield nuclear missile designed to burrow deep in the ground before detonating, precisely to get at somebody like Muammar Gaddafi, if he were bunkered, if he is bunkered. Mini-nukes were to be deployed against rogue states such as Iran, North Korea, Syria, and then the subsequently rehabilitated Libya and now destroyed Libya, divided Libya. Quote, we must be prepared to stop rogue states and their terrorist clients before they are able to threaten or use WMD, the review stated. The U.S. reserves the right to respond with overwhelming force. The U.S. reserves the right to respond with overwhelming force. By advocating the deployment of these weapons, some with cameras inserted in their warheads, and this is a camera that's inserted in the front of a B-29 bomber, I think, not in a warhead, but it's just to remind you of the place of the camera in what is being talked about. Even the warheads have cameras in them to guide. Of course, drones, everything has cameras. By advocating the deployment of these weapons, some with cameras in them, the United States proposed to erase ethical distinctions between nuclear and conventional weapons, and in the process to lower the threshold of nuclear war, for nuclear war. Such ethical distinctions have been insecure at the best of times, I now realize, but in 2002, I was struck hard by the review's implications. Although the Cold War had ended in 1989, and with it the principle of mutual assured destruction as a means of inhibiting nuclear Armageddon, a so-called second nuclear age was underway. Atomic weapons were proliferating again, and there was a new nuclear arms race. We're still in it. The first nuclear age ought to have something to say to the second, it seemed to me, and the second to the first, and photography could help say it. Missile in Pakistan. I'm going to put the screen blank for a moment, and you'll hear why. To produce a group of sentences on the Valentine's Day nuclear accident in British Columbia is to conjure up a series of images. We don't need photographs and other material forms of visual representation to produce images of what I described. We can see the flash of the bomb's explosion, the damaged aircraft flying into the side of a mountain, the upside-down figure hanging in a tree. The imagery is vivid. At the mention of Nagasaki, we might also see a ruined city with injured and dead civilians. In her critical writings on photography, Susan Sontag privileges language when she argues that photographs do not provide the narrative structure or interpretive coherence offered by words. Photographs need to be supplemented with texts and captions to produce understanding, whereas language can speak to disagreement and build understanding without photographs. In On Photography from 1977, regarding the pain of others from 25 years later, from 2003, Sontag asks whether photographs have the power to communicate the suffering of others, to convey the pain of those who experienced the atomic bombings in Japan, for example, in a sufficiently comprehensive manner to alter viewers' attitudes to the event and to war. On Photography in particular is skeptical about the capacity of photographs to incite action that might lead to social change. Sensationalist photography has become commonplace, Sontag argues, and visual representations of suffering have become trite. If photographs once had the power to shock, they now aestheticize suffering. Although photographs continue to generate emotional force, they are incapable of generating an ethical response. Or rather, they are almost incapable of generating an ethical response. For in Regarding the Pain of Others, and a related article called Regarding the Torture of Others, Sontag modifies her former conclusions, conceding that photographs of suffering and atrocity can sometimes be an invitation for viewers to think through the power structures responsible for mass suffering. Sontag's later work is helpful in explaining why those in power fear the visual representation of death and atrocity. Photographs taken in the aftermath of the bombings in Japan were censored by the United States until 1952, when the occupation ended, because American authorities feared they might sicken and enrage American viewers, turning them against the country's Cold War nuclear policies. Photographs of tortured prisoners at Abu Ghraib did sicken and enrage. And Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld expressed his frustration at the ubiquity of electronic communications such as, and I quote, digital cameras and a global internet without inhibitions that were responsible for circulating the photographs. Digital images are not easily controlled, he was admitting, making the enterprise of fighting wars and maintaining empires increasingly troublesome. President George W. Bush expressed his frustration more directly. It was regrettable, he said, that people seeing the Abu Ghraib pictures didn't understand the true nature and heart of America. Sontag's reflections on photography are relevant to discourses on the imaginary. I share many of her concerns about the medium, about what photography cannot do, but also what it can. I also have concerns about the constraints and contingencies of language, of course, about the instabilities of meaning that language produces. Shortly after publishing Precarious Life, Powers of Mourning and Violence in 2005, Judith Butler wrote a response to Sontag's ideas on photography. Her essay, Photography, War, Outrage, questions Sontag's separation of the work of photography from the work of writing. When Sontag, quote, faults photography for not being writing on the grounds that it lacks narrative continuity, Butler challenges her reasoning. Photographers build interpretation by choosing one scene over another, Butler argues, by framing what they are looking at and producing visual narratives. The chosen frame carries their purpose, and the purpose is implemented through the frame. Butler is correct, I think. Even though photography is the modern way of seeing, and the modern way of seeing is to see in fragments, when combined with language, the fragments add up. I want the fragments of language and photography brought together in this talk to add up, to produce nuclear narratives that cohere, or at least mostly cohere. In the cross-section of nuclear photographs that I'm showing, some are by Canadians, some not, some taken in Canada, some taken elsewhere. The Canadian Richard Harrington took photographs in China in 1966 of movie posters in which soldiers dressed in anti-radiation gear move forward as mushroom clouds rise nearby. And I should say that China exploded the bomb in 1964, and to this day it's still celebrated as a great patriotic act. The American Mark Rudell, who's also spent a lot of time in Canada and taught at Concordia for a while, made an artist's book of photographs in 2009 that includes images of the Canadian stripper Lily Saint-Cyr, had a great following here, was born in Verdun. And in the book, she's waiting for the bombs to go off in Nevada. Her fifth wedding was coordinated in such a way that, and with a mushroom-sized cake, mushroom cloud cake, that when a bomb went off, she would get married. And Bob Del Tredici, who grew up in the United States, but has been living in Montreal for a long time, and was when he published At Work in the Fields of the Bomb, also combines text and photography. And I show you the women of Greenham Common on the left, or somebody being carried away at Greenham Common by policemen, and on the right, Becquerel reindeer contaminated by Chernobyl. The mushroom cloud is not the only meta-symbol of the nuclear spectacle. It is not only the meta-symbol of the nuclear spectacle, but also the logo of logos in the atomic age. As already mentioned, it contains a substantial quotient of Canadian content. Here's a mushroom cake. I meant to put that up. Admiral Blandy and his wife cutting a mushroom cloud cake following the first explosions at Bikini. Contrary to C.P. Stacy's assertions, the uranium in the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was produced and partly refined by El Dorado Mining, then a Crown corporation in Canada, and sold to the United States, not the corporation, the uranium. Photographs taken during the bombings quickly turned the mushroom cloud into an iconic image, and the atomic tests conducted by the United States in the Pacific and Nevada after the war made it a staple of the mass media and popular culture. Color photographs of the mushroom cloud, and I show you two here, reproduced on the fronts of postcards from the 1950s and 1960s, for example, helped Canadians and Americans to view the bomb as a hold-in-the-hand spectacle rather than as an agent of destruction. They domesticated the bomb. And I now come to my close reading, which will take 5 minutes, and I'll be dead on the 45 minutes I said I would stick to. On March 22, 1954, the International Nickel Company, Inco, a Canadian company, published a full-page advertisement in Time magazine, and you see it on the left. The advertisement illustrates a black and white mushroom cloud, painted in grisaille, that was copied from a photograph of an underwater test explosion at Bikini Atoll in 1946, and there is the photograph on the right. The illustration, which is flopped, reversed, remains faithful to most of the characteristics of the original image, emphasizing the extremes of dark and light in the mushroom cloud and the surrounding sky and water. But it makes two notable alterations. It eliminates the boats that were placed at ground zero by the military to test the force of the bomb, and puts in their place, further out, a group of thatched huts and palm trees in the lower right foreground. The changes soften the image, transforming a representation of the atomic sublime into an image that leans in the direction of the picturesque. The reason for Inco's pictorial legerdemain can be found in the advertisement's message. Even this cloud has a silver lining. The caption reads, "Nickel alloys are needed in the reactors to produce radioisotopes for medical purposes," Inco states, "because the alloys are non-corrosive, heat-resistant, and strong. The company is ideally suited to help in the production of radioisotopes for peaceful purposes." The message of the advertisement, excuse me, I was looking up this way. The message of the advertisement is consistent with those of other 1954 Inco ads in American magazines. And there's another one on the left, "Power from the Peace Atom." That was in Collier's magazine, how Inco nickel is helping to produce power from the peace atom. President Eisenhower's recently coined slogan, "Atoms for Peace," was clearly finding an audience among military suppliers, just as the Atomic Energy Commission's promotion of nuclear power for civilian purposes was attracting commercial interest. While the this is quote, "While the AEC's weaponeers are at work in the Pacific," an article in Time magazine declared, "the AEC is going after peaceful nuclear power in a big way." From the tone and content of Inco's advertisement, readers might have been persuaded then that a significant part of the company's future lay in the medical uses of nickel. That would have been wrong. In an era of near permanent war, an era that shows no signs of abating a century later, half a century later, it follows that all corporate and government activities must be performed in the name of peace. It's become a cliche. There's a great chapter on this in a book by the Retort Group, named after Milton, and it's suddenly escaping me, but if anyone wants to know, I'll tell you after. Afflicted Powers is the name of the book. By 1950 and the outbreak of the Korean War, Inco had established a near monopoly in the production and distribution of nickel in North America. It supplied close to 80% of the United States requirements, and Congress launched an investigation into the company's market dominance and pricing practices. Nickel was, quote, a true war material, the U.S. Defense Department declared, and it wanted the Canadian company to provide secure supplies of the metal to the United States at a competitive cost. Inco's image was bruised by the congressional investigation. To repair the damage, the company increased production to bring down prices and initiated an aggressive advertising campaign to refashion itself as a concerned corporate citizen. Inco even managed to find a silver lining in the mushroom cloud, as the advertisement claimed, by converting a destructive force into a positive benefit for medicine. By 1954, the company was operating at full capacity and selling all the nickel it could mine. Only a small part of its production, however, went towards reactors that were making medical radioisotopes. Much more of its output went to feed the American war machine. A month after the advertisement in Time appeared, the Inco Triangle, an in-house company publication, reported, and I quote, "War or the preparation for war creates an immediate demand for all metals and destroys the usual balance between demand and supply. We are now in such a period because military and stockpile demands are still at a high level." The nickel supplied to the United States by Inco, like the uranium shipped from Canada to the American military by El Dorado, was directed more towards the production of mushroom clouds than to medicine. Photographs like the one used in the 1954 Inco advertisement occupy a pivotal place in the nuclear imaginary. They tell a more interrupted and complex set of narratives than is generally recounted about the ongoing atomic age and the maple leaf that is stamped all over it. Thank you.